Welcome to Inside American Politics. I'm your host, Bradley Teller, and today we're diving deep into the untold stories that shaped America long before the first shot was fired at Lexington and Concord. What if I told you that the American Revolution wasn't just about tea and taxes, but about rum runners, whiskey rebels, and even mosquitoes? What if the very spirit of American independence was forged not in grand halls, but in distilleries, taverns, and frontier workshops? Today we're going to explore how America was built on a foundation of defiance, a defiance that started with something as simple as molasses and grew into a revolution that changed the world. We'll discover how the weapons that won our independence were crafted by unknown smiths in backwoods workshops, how disease-carrying mosquitoes became unlikely allies in our fight for freedom, and how the new nation's first domestic crisis involved not foreign enemies, but homegrown whiskey makers. This is the story of how America learned to rebel, learned to create, and learned to stand on its own. One drop of rum, one rifle barrel, and one act of defiance at a time. Step behind the headlines and into the heart of power with Inside American Politics by Skoob, the AI-powered podcast experience that unpacks the drama, deals, and decisions that have defined U.S. history and continue to shape the nation's future. From the smoke-filled rooms of Washington to the front lines of cultural revolutions, each episode delivers gripping narratives that reveal the forces driving America's political machine. If you're fascinated by the personalities, power struggles, and pivotal moments that have built and broken America's political landscape, Inside American Politics is a must-listen. Explore landmark legislation, campaign masterstrokes, scandalous cover-ups, and the behind-the-scenes maneuvering that rarely makes the news. With short, binge-worthy episodes tailored to your interests, Skoob makes politics insightful, fast, and unforgettable. Download Skoob from the App Store or Play Store now. Let's begin our journey in the early 1700s, when the future United States was still a collection of British colonies, and the most revolutionary act you could commit involved something surprisingly sweet: molasses. Picture this. It's 1733, and in the bustling ports of Newport, Rhode Island, distillers are working around the clock, turning molasses into liquid gold, rum. But this wasn't just any rum. These New England craftsmen were producing an extra-strong version specifically designed for one of history's most horrific trades: purchasing slaves on Africa's west coast. Rum had become the alcoholic currency of choice, and by concentrating more alcohol into a given volume, these distillers were literally creating a more potent form of wealth. But here's where the story gets interesting, and where the seeds of American rebellion were first planted. These New England distillers weren't buying their molasses from British sugar islands. No, they were importing it from French sugar colonies, where it was cheaper and frankly better quality. Why? Because France had prohibited rum manufacturing in its own colonies to protect its domestic brandy industry. This created a perfect storm of opportunity for American entrepreneurs. Meanwhile, British sugar producers were struggling. They were losing ground to French competition in European markets, and now they had to watch as their own colonial cousins were literally funding their French rivals by buying French molasses. The British sugar lobby was furious, and they did what special interests have always done. They went crying to the government. Enter the Molasses Act of 1733, a piece of legislation that would teach Americans their first lesson in creative defiance. The act imposed a crushing duty of 6 pence per gallon on molasses imported from non-British sources. To put this in perspective, this wasn't just a tax. It was designed to be prohibitive, to force New England distillers to buy only from British sugar islands. There was just one problem with this brilliant plan. British sugar islands couldn't produce nearly enough molasses to meet demand, and what they did produce was inferior to the French product. If the Molasses Act had been strictly enforced, it would have devastated New England's economy. Remember, rum accounted for a staggering 80% of their exports at this time. And it wasn't just an export product. Americans were consuming nearly 4 gallons of rum per person per year, including men, women, and children. So what did the colonists do? They did what Americans have been doing ever since. They found a way around the system. In what can only be described as an early masterclass in civil disobedience, New England distillers resorted to wholesale smuggling. They bribed customs officials, falsified records, and turned tax evasion into an art form. And here's the beautiful irony. Most of the customs officers appointed to collect these duties were British appointees who chose to stay in England, sending junior deputies to do the actual work. These local functionaries often felt more loyalty to their neighbors than to distant masters in London. The result? Within just a few years, it's estimated that over 5/6 of all rum produced in the colonies was made from smuggled molasses. The scale of this operation was breathtaking. In Boston alone, the number of distilleries exploded from 8 in 1738 to 63 by 1750. Rum wasn't just flowing through the economy, it was the economy. It influenced everything, even politics. When George Washington ran for Virginia's local assembly in 1758, his campaign was well lubricated with massive quantities of rum, rum punch, wine, beer, and cider. Democracy, apparently, was a drinking man's game. But the Molasses Act did more than just create a generation of smugglers. It created a generation of Americans who learned that unjust laws could be safely ignored if you were clever about it. It established what we might call the smuggling precedent, the idea that when government overreaches, creative resistance isn't just acceptable, it's practically patriotic. This wasn't just about economics. The widespread evasion of the Molasses Act fundamentally undermined respect for British authority and established a precedent that would echo through American history. By making smuggling socially acceptable, even morally justified, the law taught colonists that they could successfully defy oppressive British legislation. Little did anyone know that this sweet rebellion would be the first chapter in a much larger story of American independence. Now, before we dive deeper into the specific events that led to revolution, we need to understand what made Americans different from their European cousins. Because the truth is, the American Revolution wasn't just a political event, it was the inevitable result of a fundamentally different way of thinking about human potential and social hierarchy. From the very beginning, America attracted a particular type of person. As French immigrant J. Hector Saint-Jean de Crèvecoeur famously observed, "The rich stay in Europe. It is only the middling and the poor that emigrate." Think about that for a moment. America wasn't built by the wealthy and privileged. It was built by people who had everything to gain and nothing to lose. Who were these early settlers? They were Puritans fleeing religious persecution, younger sons disadvantaged by European inheritance laws that gave everything to the firstborn, and various adventurers looking to escape the rigid social structures of the Old World. These weren't people looking to recreate European society in America. They were people trying to escape it. The sheer size and openness of America itself fostered something unprecedented in human history, a culture of constant movement and reinvention. British observers were amazed by what they called the colonists' restlessness, their refusal to stay put, their constant belief that better opportunities lay just over the next hill. One British visitor noted that Americans seemed to perpetually believe that the lands ahead were superior to the ones they already occupied. This physical mobility created something revolutionary: social mobility. In Europe, your birth determined your station in life. In America, your effort and ingenuity determined your future. Life on the frontier demanded self-reliance simply because there was no one else to rely on. There were no vast bureaucracies, no hereditary aristocracies, no elaborate patronage systems. The few official positions that did exist were often filled by what the British system considered rejects, people too lazy, inept, or marginal for positions back home. Alexander Hamilton, himself an immigrant success story, captured this perfectly when he expressed his contempt for ministerial tools and court sycophants. Americans were learning to despise the very idea of owing your success to someone else's favor rather than your own merit. British visitors were consistently struck by what they called a spirit of levelism, a lack of the hierarchical deference that defined European society. In Philadelphia, visitors noted that distinctions among citizens were minimal compared to any other civilized city in the world. Wealth alone conferred no special status because every man expected to achieve equal footing with his prosperous neighbor. Benjamin Franklin, the ultimate self-made man, embodied this new American ethos when he declared that boasting about one's ancestors merely highlighted one's own insignificance. Judge people by their own merits, Franklin argued, not by accidents of birth. This revolutionary mindset was deeply shaped by Puritanism, but not in the way most people think. Yes, the Puritans brought the Protestant work ethic that was essential for conquering a continent, but more importantly, they brought what Edmund Burke called a fierce spirit of liberty, a form of Protestantism that was fundamentally opposed to any form of mental or spiritual subjugation. Burke understood something crucial about American character when he observed that while all Protestantism contains an element of dissent, the dominant religion in the northern colonies had refined this principle of resistance to an exceptional degree. It was, he said, a form of Protestantism that epitomized dissent and resistance against implicit submission in both mind and theology. This wasn't just religious freedom. This was a fundamental rejection of the idea that any human institution, whether church or state, had the right to command unthinking obedience. Americans were learning to question authority not as an act of rebellion, but as a basic responsibility of free people. This culture of self-invention and skeptical independence didn't develop in a vacuum. It was forged by the daily reality of frontier life, where survival depended on your own skills and judgment, where the nearest government official might be hundreds of miles away, and where your neighbor's success didn't diminish your own opportunities but actually increased them. By the time the British government decided to reassert control over its American colonies, it was already too late. They weren't dealing with obedient subjects who had temporarily forgotten their place. They were dealing with a people who had fundamentally reimagined what it meant to be human. Americans had tasted self-reliance and found it intoxicating. They had experienced equality and discovered they preferred it to deference. They had learned the satisfaction of judging people by their character and abilities, rather than their connections and titles. This was the cultural foundation upon which the American Revolution was built. Not just anger over taxes and trade restrictions, but a fundamental incompatibility between two different visions of human nature and social organization. The British saw subjects who needed governing. Americans saw themselves as citizens capable of self-governance. The stage was set for conflict, and as we'll see, the tools of that conflict were being crafted in workshops and forges across the colonies by men who embodied the very spirit of American innovation and self-reliance. Now let's talk about the weapons that would help win American independence, weapons that perfectly embodied the American spirit of innovation and craftsmanship. Because while the British Army marched with standardized muskets produced in royal armories, Americans were creating something entirely different in their backwoods workshops, the American long rifle. Picture this scene. It's somewhere in the dense forests of Pennsylvania in the 1750s. In a small workshop that might double as the craftsman's home, a master gunsmith, let's call him Johann, because many of these artisans were German immigrants, is putting the finishing touches on a rifle that will change the course of history. The American long rifle wasn't invented from scratch. It evolved from the shorter-barreled, larger-caliber Swiss-German Jaeger hunting rifle used in the dense forests of Central Europe. But America demanded adaptation. The European design was too heavy, too short-ranged, and too expensive for the vast wilderness of the New World. What emerged was something uniquely American, a rifle with a barrel extending up to 4 feet in length, lighter than its European predecessors, and often personalized with the owner's name and intricate artistic designs. But the real innovation was in the rifling, the spiraling grooves cut into the bore of the barrel that caused the bullet to spin, dramatically improving accuracy. John Dillon captured the almost mystical quality of this craftsmanship in his 1924 book, The Kentucky Rifle. From a flat bar of soft iron, hand-forged into a gun barrel, laboriously bored and rifled with crude tools, fitted with a stock hewn from a maple tree in the neighboring forest, and supplied with a lock hammered to shape on the anvil, an unknown smith in a shop long since silent fashioned a rifle which changed the whole course of world history, made possible the settlement of a continent, and ultimately freed our country of foreign domination. This was the epitome of what we might call the American manufacturing spirit, small-scale, personalized, innovative. Each rifle was a custom creation, made by a craftsman who knew his customer personally, often from church or market interactions. No two rifles were identical, because they weren't meant to be. They were personal tools, extensions of their owner's skills and character. The process of making these rifles was a masterclass in frontier ingenuity. Working with crude tools in workshops that would barely qualify as sheds by modern standards, these gunsmiths created precision instruments that outperformed anything coming out of European factories. They hand-forged barrels from iron bars, laboriously bored them out with primitive tools, cut the rifling grooves by hand, and shaped the wooden stocks from local maple trees. When you fired one of these rifles, and I can tell you from personal experience, having shot a vintage flintlock long rifle, you immediately understood why they were so revolutionary. At 9 pounds, they felt surprisingly light compared to the heavy muskets of the day. The firing process was deliberate and precise. Align the target through the immaculate sighting system, pull the trigger, watch the sparks fly as flint struck the frizzen, feel the brief flash of ignition, then experience the delayed sensation of recoil as the main powder charge sent the patched lead ball down range, followed by a thick cloud of gray smoke. But here's what made these rifles truly revolutionary: accuracy. While a musket might hit a man-sized target at 50 yards on a good day, a skilled marksman with a long rifle could reliably hit targets at 200, 300, even 400 yards. The long barrel, ranging from 35 to 48 inches compared to the 30-inch musket barrel, gave the black powder more time to burn, increasing both accuracy and velocity. These rifles were originally designed for hunting on the frontier, where precision was essential. When you're hunting deer or rabbits in the wilderness, you get one shot. Miss, and by the time you reload, your dinner has disappeared into the forest. But what made these rifles perfect for hunting also made them devastatingly effective in warfare, when that warfare involved picking off individual targets rather than massed battlefield formations. The calibers varied, round balls ranging from .25 to .75 caliber, though most commonly around .40 to .50. Remember, this was the era of artisanal manufacturing. Every gunsmith had his own standards, his own techniques, his own ideas about what worked best. Some rifles, like the one supposedly used by Sergeant Murphy at the Battle of Saratoga, even featured innovations like double barrels in an over-under configuration, allowing for quicker successive shots. Now, you might wonder, if these rifles were so superior, why didn't everyone use them? The answer tells us a lot about the difference between European and American approaches to warfare. The British, and most European armies, relied on massed formations of soldiers firing smooth-bore muskets in coordinated volleys. This wasn't about individual marksmanship. It was about disciplined units delivering overwhelming firepower at close range. Muskets were faster to load because the bullet was smaller than the barrel, allowing for easy ramming even after multiple firings had fouled the barrel with burnt powder. Muskets could mount bayonets for close combat, which was often how battles were actually decided. And most importantly, muskets allowed for the kind of coordinated simultaneous firing that was the foundation of 18th century military tactics. Rifles, on the other hand, were slower to load because the bullet had to fit snugly in the rifled barrel. After several shots, fouling could make loading nearly impossible without thorough cleaning. Rifles weren't designed for bayonets, making them useless in hand-to-hand combat, and rifles encouraged individual marksmanship rather than coordinated unit tactics. But in the American wilderness, these supposed disadvantages became advantages. When you're fighting in guerrilla war, when your enemy is trying to march in neat formations through dense forests, when you need to make every shot count because ammunition is scarce, that's when the American long rifle became the perfect weapon for the American way of war. These rifles weren't just tools. They were symbols of American ingenuity, self-reliance, and individual skill triumphing over European notions of standardized, mass-produced warfare. They represented a different philosophy, that a free citizen with a well-made rifle could outfight a professional soldier with government-issued equipment. As we'll see, this philosophy would be put to the ultimate test when British and American forces clashed in the forests and fields of North America. And when that test came, it would be American riflemen, with their custom-made weapons and their tradition of individual marksmanship, who would help tip the balance toward independence. By 1762, the stage was set for a dramatic escalation in the growing conflict between Britain and its American colonies. And at the center of this crisis was one of America's most fascinating figures, Benjamin Franklin, who was about to discover that being a celebrated intellectual couldn't protect you from the hard realities of imperial politics. When Franklin returned to Pennsylvania after 5 years in London, he was no longer the jobbing printer who had been ridiculed as a water-drinking American during his first visit. Now he was an internationally celebrated figure of the Enlightenment, an honorary fellow of the Royal Society, famous across Europe for his groundbreaking experiments with electricity. He had traveled as the official representative of the Pennsylvania Assembly to petition the king himself about unfair taxation. Franklin's rise from colonial nobody to international celebrity seemed to prove that the American dream was real. But Franklin was about to learn a hard lesson about the limits of individual achievement in the face of systemic injustice. The immediate crisis involved the same issue that had sparked the smuggling revolution 30 years earlier, the rum and molasses trade. During the French and Indian War, what Europeans called the 7 Years' War, the profitable but illegal commerce between New England and French sugar islands had continued, now with a cynical twist that revealed just how corrupt the whole system had become. Instead of simple smuggling, traders were exploiting a wartime convention, allowing enemies to communicate through flags of truce. These were supposed to facilitate humanitarian exchanges like prisoner swaps. But colonial entrepreneurs turned this into a massive money-making scheme. A single prisoner, sometimes just a nominal prisoner who was actually a paid participant, was enough to secure a flag of truce that made your trading ship untouchable. Colonial governors auctioned off these permits or sold them at set prices. The profits were so enormous that basic foodstuffs from New England were actually cheaper in French Haiti than in British Jamaica. Only Virginia maintained any integrity in the system. Its governor shocked other colonial officials by refusing a bribe of £400 for a questionable permit. The Royal Navy finally decided to restore some sanity by sailing into Monte Cristi, a neutral Spanish port, and seizing ships as prizes of war. Though the Admiralty Court later ordered compensation for some owners, the message was clear: the old system was ending. In Salem alone, over 200 boats were seized during the war's final 3 years. This created two immediate problems. It alienated merchants and ship owners, and it created a rum shortage that drove up prices of America's favorite beverage. But the real crisis came after the war ended. Global domination, it turned out, was expensive. The British government, facing massive debts from defending its empire, decided that grateful American colonists should contribute through new duties on imported goods. In 1764, they introduced the Sugar Act, which seemed reasonable at first glance. It actually lowered the duty rate on molasses from the old Molasses Act. But the devil was in the details, and those details revealed a fundamental shift in British policy that would change everything. First, the Sugar Act tightened enforcement dramatically, entrusting collection to the Royal Navy rather than easily corrupted local officials. Any vessel under 50 tons found loitering within 6 miles of the coast was automatically suspected of smuggling and could be seized. If the charge held up in a British Admiralty court, the officers and crew of the capturing naval vessel shared the value of the ship and its cargo. Think about what this meant. Royal Navy captains now had a direct financial incentive to arrest any American boat they encountered. Colonists viewed this as an open invitation for legalized piracy by their own government. The Sugar Act also imposed duties on imported wines, including Madeira, the preferred drink of wealthy planters. This wasn't just about revenue, it was about control. Madeira, the Canary Islands, and the Azores had been important markets for American produce, but the new duty effectively destroyed this trade. Colonists had been promised they could import directly from Portugal and Spain, but London wine merchants sabotaged this concession through their political influence. The result? Americans were forced to pay higher prices for wine while simultaneously being denied access to markets for their own goods. This was where Franklin's mission became crucial. By 1764, he was back in London as Pennsylvania's representative, tasked with fighting these injustices. Despite his international reputation, despite his eloquent letters to the press, despite vigorous lobbying, British merchants wielded more influence in Parliament. The restrictions not only persisted, they got worse. The discrimination was personal and constant. Every time a wealthy American sipped expensive Madeira or observed unsold goods in his warehouse, he was reminded of his second-class status in his own empire. Franklin, ever the practical innovator, tried to turn this crisis into opportunity. In the 1765 edition of Poor Richard's Almanac, his alter ego offered Americans practical advice for achieving beverage independence, instructions for making wine from wild grapes, for raising Madeira-style wine in America, and for improving corn spirits so as they may be preferable to rum. His reasoning was economic and political. As we raise more corn than the English West India Islands can take off, and since we cannot now well sell it to the foreign islands, what can we do with the overplus better than to turn it into spirit, and thereby lessen the demand for West India rum, which our grain will not pay for? Franklin was essentially advocating for what we'd now call import substitution, replacing foreign products with domestic alternatives as a form of economic resistance. But the British government seemed determined to make enemies of its American subjects. The Sugar Act was followed by the Stamp Act of 1765, which required that most official documents be stamped at government expense before they could be used. Opposition was so widespread that a Stamp Act Congress convened in New York, with representatives from 9 colonies adopting a Declaration of Rights and Grievances. Then came the Quartering Act of 1765, requiring that British troops be housed at colonial expense in barns, inns, stables, and the homes of wine and spirits dealers, with colonists providing 5 pints of beer daily per soldier. When the New York Assembly refused to comply, the city celebrated with a street party featuring a roasted ox, a hogshead of rum, and 25 barrels of ale. The pattern was becoming clear. Every British attempt to raise revenue or assert control generated more resistance and more colonial unity. The inability of these acts to raise their projected revenues, the Sugar Act cost £8,000 to administer for every 2,000 it raised, should have been a warning. Instead, the government doubled down with the Townshend Acts, levying duties on various imported products with enforcement again left to the Royal Navy and Admiralty courts. Charles Townshend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, was reportedly capable of making brilliant speeches even when drunk, and the legislation named after him had what one observer called a certain inebriated optimism mixed with muddled belligerence. By now, alcohol had become central to the growing discord between Britain and America. The destruction of the rum trade, the closure of traditional markets, and the price inflation of alcoholic beverages directly impacted most Americans' daily lives. These weren't abstract political principles. They were practical grievances that affected everyone from wealthy merchants to working farmers. The colonial response was to strengthen intercolonial ties through circular letters and form resistance organizations. The most famous of these was the Sons of Liberty, with chapters in New York, Boston, and eventually Georgia. And here's where our story comes full circle. The Boston chapter was founded by Samuel Adams, who operated a malting business, and they met at taverns like the Green Dragon or the Bunch of Grapes. These weren't just meeting places. They were symbols of what the British policies were destroying. At the Green Dragon, revolutionaries gathered around a specially commissioned punch bowl crafted by Paul Revere. The Liberty Bowl held 45 gills of punch and weighed 45 ounces, with political inscriptions celebrating resistance to British authority. The bowl itself was a work of political art, commemorating the glorious 92 Massachusetts representatives who had voted against rescinding a circular letter condemning British policies. This wasn't just drinking, it was ritualized resistance, turning social gathering into political action. What the British government failed to understand was that by targeting the alcohol trade, they weren't just threatening colonial profits. They were attacking the social and cultural foundations of colonial life. Rum, beer, and wine weren't luxuries in 18th century America. They were necessities, currencies, and symbols of hospitality and community. By the time the crisis reached its peak, Americans had learned not just to resist British policies, but to create alternatives. They were developing their own manufacturing, their own trade networks, their own political organizations. What had started as protests against unfair taxation was becoming something much more dangerous to British control, a movement toward complete independence. The stage was set for the final confrontation, and as we'll see, even the mosquitoes would play a role in determining the outcome. American politics isn't just about elections and headlines. It's a deep, ongoing story of ideals, power, conflict, and change, shaped by bold leaders, everyday voices, and behind-the-scenes decisions that have defined the nation across generations. Digging deeper reveals surprising twists, pivotal moments, and hidden truths that continue to shape the country we live in today. Follow, like, and subscribe to Inside American Politics by Skoob on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, and see the story of America unfold like never before. Now here's where our story takes a turn that might surprise you. Because while we've been talking about human actors, smugglers, craftsmen, politicians, and rebels, some of America's most effective allies in the fight for independence were creatures so small you could swat them with your hand: mosquitoes. This isn't a joke or a metaphor. Disease-carrying mosquitoes, what one historian playfully called General Anopheles and General Aedes, were about to play a decisive role not just in American independence, but in reshaping the entire Western Hemisphere. The story begins with yellow fever and malaria, two mosquito-borne diseases that were endemic to many parts of the Americas, but to which Europeans had little natural resistance. While American colonists had been exposed to these diseases for generations and had developed some immunity, British troops arriving from Europe were sitting ducks. During the American Revolution, yellow fever and malaria decimated British forces throughout the South and in the Caribbean. These diseases didn't discriminate. They struck officers and enlisted men alike, reducing entire regiments to skeletal crews of fever-racked soldiers. The British found themselves fighting not just American rebels, but invisible enemies that could destroy an army without firing a shot. But the mosquito's most dramatic intervention in American history was yet to come, and it would involve not just the British, but the French and Spanish as well. After the American Revolution ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, Britain retained Canada but lost significant territories. British Florida went to Spain, France received Senegal and Tobago, and the United States gained all territory east of the Mississippi River from Florida to the Great Lakes. The elimination of the Proclamation Line more than doubled American territory overnight. But this was just the beginning of mosquito-assisted territorial expansion. The key moment came during Napoleon's attempts to rebuild the French Empire in the Americas. Napoleon had grand plans. He would use the Caribbean island of Haiti as a base for French operations in North America, then reoccupy Louisiana and challenge British and American expansion westward. There was just one problem. The Haitian slaves, led by Toussaint Louverture, had other ideas. They had rebelled against French rule and were fighting for their independence. Napoleon decided to crush this rebellion with overwhelming force, sending thousands of French troops to restore colonial control. What happened next was one of the most decisive military interventions by disease in human history. French soldiers, fresh from European campaigns, had no resistance to yellow fever and malaria. The mosquitoes of Haiti destroyed Napoleon's expeditionary force more thoroughly than any human army could have. The numbers are staggering. Tens of thousands of French soldiers died not from combat, but from disease. Napoleon's grand strategy for the Americas collapsed, not because of military defeat, but because his armies simply dissolved in the tropical heat and fever. This catastrophe had immediate consequences for American expansion. Napoleon, facing the loss of his American base in Haiti and needing money to fund his European wars, decided to cut his losses. In 1703, he offered to sell the entire Louisiana territory to the United States for the bargain price of $15 million. Think about that. Mosquitoes in Haiti directly enabled the Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the size of the United States and made possible the expeditions of Lewis and Clark. American Manifest Destiny wasn't just about human ambition and political vision. It was enabled by tiny insects that destroyed European colonial ambitions. But the mosquitoes weren't finished. Their influence spread throughout the Americas as independence movements erupted across Spanish colonies. Simón Bolívar, the great liberator of South America, found that Spanish colonial forces suffered the same fate as the British and French. They were devastated by diseases to which local populations had greater resistance. Bolívar himself understood this dynamic, comparing the collapse of Spanish control to the fall of the Roman Empire. He recognized that European powers were struggling not just against human revolutionaries, but against the biological realities of tropical America. The pattern was consistent across the hemisphere. European colonial forces, fresh from temperate climates, proved vulnerable to diseases that local populations had learned to survive. This gave independence movements a crucial advantage that had nothing to do with military strategy or political organization. The irony is profound. While European colonizers had often defeated indigenous populations through disease, smallpox and other Old World diseases had devastated Native American populations. Now mosquito-borne diseases native to the Americas were helping American independence movements defeat European imperial ambitions. By 1800, the demographic consequences were dramatic. In Canada, over 90,000 American loyalists had fled north after the Revolution, many escaping not just political persecution, but also the yellow fever epidemics that ravaged U.S. coastal cities from 1793 to 1805. British Canadians now outnumbered French Canadians by 10 to 1, fundamentally altering the character of North America. Historian J.R. McNeill captured the broader significance of this era when he noted that while we remember the dramatic political events and heroic figures like Washington, Toussaint Louverture, and Bolívar, we often overlook the role of mosquitoes in the outcomes of these revolutions. These tiny creatures were instrumental in the downfall of European colonial empires, dispensing both liberty and death and heralding a new epoch of freedom. The mosquito's role in American independence reveals something important about historical causation. The grand sweep of human events is often influenced by factors we never consider. Military strategy, political philosophy, and economic interests all mattered, but so did biology, geography, and the humble mosquito. This biological dimension of American independence also helps explain why the United States was able to expand so rapidly across the continent. European powers, having learned hard lessons about the cost of tropical campaigning, were less eager to challenge American expansion into territories where yellow fever and malaria might again decimate their forces. The mosquitoes had done more than aid American independence. They had redefined the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere, making possible the rise of the United States as a continental power and accelerating the collapse of European colonial empires throughout the Americas. As we'll see, this biological advantage would prove crucial as the young United States faced its next great challenge, learning to govern itself and deal with the internal conflicts that threatened to tear the new nation apart. While Americans were fighting for political independence, an equally revolutionary transformation was taking place across the Atlantic, one that would ultimately prove just as consequential for the future of both nations. On July 10, 1776, as newspapers in America began printing the Declaration of Independence, a remarkable scene was unfolding in Birmingham, England. Four men, John Wilkinson, an ironmaster, Samuel Moore, Secretary of the Royal Society for Arts, Manufacture and Commerce, Josiah Wedgwood, the master potter, and Matthew Bolton, industrialist, were doing something that perfectly symbolized the revolutionary spirit of the age. As Wilkinson's biographer recorded, the four men took off their coats, rolled up their sleeves, and dismantled the engine piece by piece to understand the detail of its working. They then reassembled it and had it running satisfactorily again by evening. This wasn't just mechanical curiosity. This was the spirit of innovation and understanding that would transform the world. As Americans were taking apart the machinery of colonial government to understand how political power worked, these Englishmen were taking apart steam engines to understand how mechanical power worked. The irony is striking. While Britain was losing its American colonies through political rigidity and failure to adapt, it was simultaneously creating the industrial technologies that would make it the dominant world power for the next century. A decade later, Irish politician Lord Sheffield would articulate this parallel when he reflected on Britain's losses and gains. After Britain's defeat in the American Revolutionary War, Sheffield noted the significance of technological advances. Mr. Court's improvements in iron production, the steam engine innovations by Boulton and Watt, and Lord Dundonald's cost-effective method of producing coke from coal. Sheffield made a remarkable claim. These technological innovations might prove more valuable to Great Britain than retaining the 13 American colonies would have been. Think about that. He was suggesting that losing America might actually benefit Britain if it forced the nation to focus on industrial innovation rather than colonial exploitation. This wasn't just speculation. The Industrial Revolution that was beginning in Britain would indeed transform the global economy more dramatically than any colonial empire ever had. Steam power, improved metallurgy, and mechanized production would create wealth on a scale that made traditional colonial economics look primitive. But here's what makes this story even more interesting. America wasn't completely disconnected from this technological revolution. A steam engine had been operating in New Jersey since 1755, pumping water from a copper mine. Connecticut inventor John Fitch was experimenting with steamboats on the Delaware River. Americans were adapting and innovating right alongside their former colonial masters. This parallel development of political and technological revolution reveals something crucial about the late 18th century. It was an age when people believed that everything could be improved, reformed, or completely reimagined. The same spirit that led Americans to declare that all men are created equal led British inventors to believe that steam could replace muscle, that machines could multiply human productivity, and that traditional ways of doing things were just starting points for innovation. The American revolutionaries and the British industrialists shared more than they might have admitted. Both groups were taking established systems apart to understand how they worked. Both were convinced that they could build something better. Both were willing to risk everything on untested ideas. Consider the parallels. American political revolutionaries were experimenting with democratic governance, separation of powers, and individual rights, all concepts that seemed impossibly radical to most Europeans. British industrial revolutionaries were experimenting with steam power, mechanized production, and factory organization, concepts that seemed equally impossible to most traditional craftsmen. Both revolutions required not just new ideas, but new ways of thinking about human potential. Democracy assumed that ordinary people could make intelligent political decisions. Industrialization assumed that ordinary people could learn to operate complex machinery and organize efficient production. Both revolutions also required a willingness to abandon traditional social hierarchies. American democracy rejected the idea that some people were born to rule others. British industrialization rejected the idea that production had to follow ancient craft traditions. The economic implications were profound. While Americans were creating a political system designed to unleash individual economic initiative, the British were creating industrial technologies that would multiply the productive power of that initiative. When these two revolutions eventually came together in the 19th century, the result would be unprecedented economic growth and global influence. But in 1776, these were still separate experiments taking place on opposite sides of the Atlantic. The question was whether the new American nation could successfully combine political innovation with technological advancement, or whether it would fall behind the European powers who were investing heavily in industrial development. The early signs were encouraging. American inventors like Oliver Evans were developing automated flour milling. American entrepreneurs were adapting British manufacturing techniques to American conditions. Most importantly, the American political system was creating incentives for innovation by protecting intellectual property and rewarding entrepreneurship. What neither the American revolutionaries nor the British industrialists could foresee was how completely these two revolutions would transform not just their own societies, but the entire world. Political democracy would spread across the globe, challenging every form of traditional authority. Industrial technology would create possibilities for human prosperity that previous generations couldn't have imagined. The relationship between these parallel revolutions also helps explain why Britain and America, despite their conflict during the Revolutionary War, would eventually become close allies. They were both revolutionary societies, both committed to the idea that human institutions could and should be continuously improved. The Americans had proved that political revolution was possible, that people could create new forms of government based on reason and consent rather than tradition and force. The British were proving that technological revolution was possible, that people could create new forms of production based on science and innovation rather than custom and craft. Together, these revolutions would create the modern world. But first, the new American nation had to survive its own growing pains, including internal conflicts that would test whether a democratic republic could maintain order and unity while protecting individual liberty. As we'll see, even these internal conflicts would be shaped by the same forces we've been discussing: the American preference for individual initiative over government control, and the continuing importance of alcohol in American economic and social life. By 1791, the United States had won its independence and established a new government, but the young nation was about to face its first major test of federal authority. And once again, the crisis would revolve around alcohol, taxes, and the fundamental question of who had the right to tell Americans how to live their lives. The setting for this new conflict was the western frontier, particularly the mountains and valleys of western Pennsylvania, where a new generation of Americans was creating a new kind of economy and a new kind of rebellion. During the colonial period and the Revolution, rum had been America's drink of choice. But as settlers moved westward, away from the seaboard ports where molasses arrived from the Caribbean, they discovered a better alternative: whiskey, distilled from the grains they could grow in their own fields. This wasn't just a matter of taste or convenience. The shift from rum to whiskey represented a shift from dependence on imported raw materials to self-sufficiency based on local resources. Many of these Western settlers were Scotch-Irish immigrants who brought centuries of grain distilling knowledge with them. They knew how to turn barley, wheat, rye, and corn into liquid wealth. And wealth it was. By 1791, Western Pennsylvania alone hosted over 5,000 pot stills, one for every 6 people, including children. Think about that ratio for a moment. This wasn't just drinking. This was an entire economy built around distillation. Whiskey served all the functions that rum had served in colonial New England, but with crucial differences. A packhorse could carry more value in distilled whiskey than in raw grain, making it an efficient form of portable wealth. Whiskey was traded for salt, sugar, iron, and gunpowder. It was used to pay farm workers, incorporated into birth and death rituals, and even required for signing legal documents. Politicians gave whiskey to voters during campaigns, and clergymen received it as payment for their services. Jurors in courthouses were often given whiskey before deliberating. This wasn't a luxury economy. This was a necessity economy where whiskey functioned as both currency and commodity. Enter Alexander Hamilton, the brilliant and ambitious Secretary of the Treasury, with a plan that seemed perfectly reasonable from the federal government's perspective. The United States faced massive debts from the Revolutionary War, and Hamilton proposed a federal excise tax on distilled spirits to help pay those debts. Hamilton's reasoning was sophisticated. The tax would generate revenue while potentially curbing excessive drinking, benefiting agriculture, economy, societal morals, and health. The law, enacted in March 1791, gave distillers a choice: pay an annual levy or an excise duty of at least 7 cents per gallon, depending on the liquor's strength. From Hamilton's perspective in New York or Philadelphia, this seemed like smart policy. From the perspective of a frontier farmer in western Pennsylvania, it looked like the federal government was repeating exactly the same mistakes that had driven America to rebel against Britain. The problem wasn't just the tax itself, it was what the tax represented. The excise applied to liquor at the point of production, not at the point of sale. This meant that even whiskey produced for personal consumption or barter was subject to taxation. For frontier families who had moved west to escape government interference, this felt like a betrayal of everything the Revolution had promised. James Jackson of Georgia captured the frontier sentiment when he declared in the House of Representatives that the excise would deprive people of distilled spirits, their sole luxury. He warned that if the government could tax whiskey production, what would stop them from taxing other aspects of daily life? Even washing a shirt could be taxed in the future, he predicted. The opposition also reflected deeper divisions about federalism. Eastern Americans were generally more willing to accept federal authority taking precedence over state authority. Southern and Western Americans preferred state and local control over their own affairs. The requirement that offenders be tried in federal courts in Philadelphia rather than local courts seemed designed to favor Eastern interests over Western ones. As the law took effect, many frontier farmers chose simple non-compliance. But this wasn't the genteel tax avoidance of colonial rum smugglers. This was violent resistance. Revenue collectors were assaulted, their documents stolen and destroyed, their horses' saddles slashed. Organized groups attacked distillers who paid the excise, treating them as traitors to the frontier community. The most serious resistance came from 4 western Pennsylvania counties: Fayette, Allegheny, Westmoreland, and Washington. Despite amendments in 1792 and 1794 that reduced taxes on rural distillers and allowed state courts to try offenders, the rebellion continued to escalate. In July 1794, the situation exploded into open violence when Federal Marshal David Lennox served a writ on William Miller, a farmer who had refused to pay the excise. What followed was a battle that left several people dead and marked the point of no return in federal frontier relations. David Bradford, an ambitious attorney, seized leadership of what became known as the Whiskey Boys. Within days, he had rallied 6,000 armed men at Braddock's Field near Pittsburgh. These weren't just protesters. They were an army, complete with military drills and revolutionary rhetoric. The rebels passed resolutions calling for secession from the United States and the establishment of an independent Western state. They were essentially threatening to undo the revolution by creating their own revolution against the federal government they had helped create. President George Washington, acting on Hamilton's advice, responded with overwhelming force. 13,000 militiamen from eastern Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Virginia, and Maryland marched toward Pittsburgh with artillery, supplies, and, in a nice touch of irony, tax-paid whiskey for the troops. But by the time the Federal Army arrived, the rebellion was already collapsing. Bradford had fled west, and his supporters had dispersed. The presence of 13,000 soldiers with hard cash actually helped resolve the crisis by providing a market for local whiskey, enabling distillers to pay their taxes. About 20 rebels were taken to Philadelphia, paraded through the streets as examples, and jailed for a few months. 2 received death sentences but were pardoned by Washington. The show of federal force had achieved its purpose without major bloodshed. In the end, the whiskey excise was a failure as policy, repealed a few years later when Thomas Jefferson became president. The cost of suppressing the rebellion, $1.5 million, was nearly a third of all the revenue the tax had collected during its entire existence. But the Whiskey Rebellion was a success as a demonstration of federal authority. Washington and Hamilton had proved that the new government could enforce its laws against domestic resistance, not just foreign enemies. Federal law could not be ignored, even on the frontier. The rebellion's aftermath reveals the continuing importance of westward migration in American development. Many Scotch-Irish rebels moved further west to Kentucky, where they began producing a new type of whiskey from corn and rye. This Kentucky whiskey, particularly from Bourbon County, became known as bourbon and developed its distinctive flavor from local corn varieties. And here's a delicious historical irony. In his later years, George Washington himself became a whiskey distiller. Acting on advice from his Scottish farm manager, Washington established a distillery at Mount Vernon that by 1799 was producing 11,000 gallons of rye whiskey annually and generating $7,500 in profit. Meanwhile, Thomas Jefferson, who would later repeal Hamilton's whiskey tax, condemned whiskey as poison and advocated for wine consumption instead. Jefferson tried to cultivate wine grapes in America and pushed for reduced tariffs on imported wine, but wine remained expensive and never achieved whiskey's cultural significance as a symbol of American independence and self-sufficiency. The Whiskey Rebellion demonstrated that the new American nation faced the same fundamental challenge that had driven the Revolution: balancing the legitimate need for government authority with the equally legitimate desire for individual freedom. The solution wasn't to eliminate either government power or individual liberty, but to create institutions and processes that could accommodate both. This ongoing tension would define American politics for generations to come, but the basic framework had been established. The federal government had the authority to enforce its laws, but that authority would be exercised through democratic processes that gave citizens the power to change those laws through elections rather than rebellion. As we reach the end of our journey through these untold stories of American independence, I want you to step back and consider what we've discovered together. We began with smugglers evading the Molasses Act, and we've ended with whiskey rebels challenging federal authority. We've seen how American rifles, crafted in frontier workshops, helped win a revolution. We've learned how mosquitoes aided independence and how parallel revolutions in technology and politics reshaped the world. These stories reveal something profound about the American character that goes far beyond the familiar tales of Boston Tea Parties and Valley Forge. What emerges from these episodes is a portrait of a people who were revolutionary, not just in 1776, but as a fundamental aspect of their character and culture. The rum smugglers of the 1730s weren't just evading taxes, they were establishing the principle that unjust laws could be safely ignored if you were clever and united in your resistance. The frontier gunsmiths weren't just making weapons, they were embodying a philosophy that individual craftsmanship and innovation could outperform mass-produced, government-standardized equipment. Benjamin Franklin wasn't just protesting the Sugar Act, he was demonstrating that Americans could solve their problems through ingenuity and self-reliance rather than petitioning distant authorities for relief. The whiskey rebels weren't just resisting taxation, they were defending the idea that local communities should control their own economic and social arrangements. What connects all these stories is the emergence of a distinctly American approach to the relationship between individual freedom and collective authority. Europeans generally assumed that order required hierarchy, that progress required elite direction, that ordinary people needed to be governed by their betters. Americans developed a different assumption. That order could emerge from individual initiative, that progress came from unleashing human creativity rather than directing it, that ordinary people were capable of governing themselves if given the proper institutions and incentives. This wasn't just political theory, it was lived experience. The frontier demanded self-reliance because there was no alternative. The colonial economy rewarded innovation because traditional methods often didn't work in new circumstances. The American social structure encouraged mobility and experimentation because rigid hierarchies couldn't function in a rapidly changing society. Even the mosquitoes fit this pattern. They aided American independence not through any conscious design, but by creating conditions where local adaptation and resistance proved superior to imperial force and European military organization. The technological and industrial innovations happening simultaneously in Britain weren't completely separate from these American developments. Both represented the same fundamental insight, that human institutions, whether political or economic, could be continuously improved through reason, experimentation, and the accumulated wisdom of individual experience. What made America unique was the combination of political democracy with economic opportunity, of individual freedom with social cooperation, of skepticism toward authority with respect for legitimate law. This wasn't a perfect system. It took generations to extend its benefits to all Americans, and we're still working on that project today. But the foundation was sound, a society organized around the principle that ordinary people, given freedom and opportunity, could create extraordinary results. Not because they were guided by superior wisdom from above, but because their own wisdom, accumulated through experience and shared through democratic institutions, was the best guide available for human progress. The spirits that flow through these stories, rum, whiskey, wine, and beer, weren't just beverages. They were symbols of economic independence, social connection, and the right to enjoy the fruits of your own labor. When the British government attacked the alcohol trade, it was attacking the foundation of colonial economic and social life. When Americans defended their right to make, trade, and consume alcohol on their own terms, they were defending something larger: the right to organize their communities according to their own values rather than distant authorities' preferences. The rifles that won American independence weren't just weapons. They were products of a manufacturing philosophy that valued individual craftsmanship over mass production, local adaptation over standardized uniformity, personal skill over institutional authority. The mosquitoes that aided American independence weren't just insects. They were biological expressions of the same principle that drove human resistance to imperial control: local conditions favoring local adaptation over foreign domination. These stories, taken together, reveal that American independence wasn't just a political event that happened in the 1770s and 1780s. It was a cultural transformation that had been building for generations and would continue developing long after the last British soldier left American soil. The true spirit of the American Revolution lives on, not in monuments or ceremonies, but in the continuing American faith that ordinary people, given freedom and opportunity, can solve their own problems, improve their own conditions, and create a better future for their children. That spirit was born in colonial distilleries and frontier workshops. It was nurtured by smugglers and craftsmen who refused to accept that distant authorities knew better than they did about their own needs and capabilities. It was tested by rebels who were willing to risk everything for the principle that legitimate government must be based on the consent of the governed. And it continues today in every American who believes that the future can be better than the past, that problems can be solved through ingenuity and cooperation, that individual freedom and collective responsibility can coexist and reinforce each other. The revolution didn't end in 1783. It continues every time Americans choose innovation over tradition, cooperation over hierarchy, hope over fear. The spirits of revolution, the rum runners, the rifle makers, the whiskey rebels, and yes, even the mosquitoes, live on in the enduring American conviction that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they're free to try. That's the real story of American independence, and it's a story that's still being written today. I'm your host, Bradley Teller, and this has been Inside American Politics. Thank you for joining me as we uncovered the pivotal decisions, behind-the-scenes power plays, and defining moments that continue to shape the United States today. If this episode challenged what you thought you knew, opened your eyes to a new perspective, or sparked your curiosity about America's political journey, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you're listening now. And if you're eager for even more bite-sized deep dives, from landmark legislation and political scandals to the unsung voices who've changed the course of the nation, check out Skoob, your AI-powered podcast studio app. Download it today from the App Store or Play Store and explore American politics, faster, deeper, and smarter. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep discovering.